We are so used to having the New Testament, right? Those 27 books. And it's pretty common to run across Christians that say, we have no law but the Bible. But let's be honest about this. From an historical point of view, we have to acknowledge that the church existed since roughly 30 A.D. And there are different ideas about the precise year, but roughly 30 A.D. And it's not until the end of the 4th century that there is this one canon that all the churches in Europe and Asia and Africa are using. And during those almost 4 centuries, the church is growing and it's vibrant and it's doing quite well during that roughly 360-year period. So in a way, the New Testament is part of the tradition of the church, and I mean the canon. So today what I want to talk about is how was this canon formed? How was the New Testament canon formed? Well, the first point is that the church already had the idea of a canon. What do we mean by the word canon? Anyone want to take
stick?
A stick, okay. And how does that have to do with what we're talking about here?
Measuring rod.
It's a measuring rod. Very good. What other kind of canons do we talk about? Right? We're talking about the New Testament canon. What are some of the great books of, like, say, the canon of great American literature? What would be some books in there? Stephen King's It, maybe? No? Yeah, Moby Dick, Tom Sawyer, The Scarlet Letter. So a canon refers to a sort of a group of, in this case, writings that is generally recognized as being special, normative, of having a kind of authority and character to it that other books don't have. So that's what we're talking about with the canon. So the first point that I want to make is that the idea of a canon, that already existed. Because by this time, we already have the Septuagint. We had talked about this a couple of weeks ago. The Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Old Testament, including the deuterocanonical books. That will become controversial during the Reformation, but we are fortunately not doing the Reformation in this class. But the point is that you had these books, and you had this list of books, and even with the very earliest church fathers, people like Justin Martyr and Clement of Rome, they could refer to Scripture. And they do this often. They'll say, well, Scripture says, da 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 da. And that could be a quote from Genesis, or one of the Psalms, or Isaiah, or perhaps, Sirach, or Tobit, or something like that. But the point is, they already had this idea that you can get this collection of books that has a unique authority to it. So, and of course, I referenced the Septuagint, and of course, at this time also, there's what's called the Masoretic text, which is still in Hebrew. As the church continues to grow, especially among Gentiles, though, it really is the Septuagint that has the most usage. Well, what is the first attempt at forming a canon? So much of church history, especially early church history, but we could say the same thing about medieval and Reformation history, is not people who are getting together, leaders and bishops, and saying, let's go ahead and map out a 50-year plan for this thing called the Christian church. So much of it is like the Arian controversy, which we looked at last week. And someone would go to a bishop and say, I heard from my cousin in Alexandria that the Son is not eternal with the Father. And then the bishop is like, whoa, okay, let's deal with this. So much of it is kind of like running around putting out fires. And the formation of the New Testament canon is like that too, believe it or not. The very early church, of course, didn't have an idea that they had to form a canon. Why did they not have this idea? Because Jesus was coming back right away, okay? They believed in the imminent return. But of course, as they have this realization that the return of Christ, the parousia, is going to be extended to who knows when, this did become a viable option to do something like the Septuagint. Well, the beginning of the story starts with a bishop in a town called Sinope, which is presently in Turkey on the Black Sea. I've been to Turkey several times, but I have not been to Sinope, which today is a totally Muslim town. And there's a fellow there named Marcion. The dates for his life are roughly 85 to 160. So this is really early stuff. Marcion, according to some of the church history, which tends to be sort of polemical, but Marcion had been at the church in Rome. He was related to some other church leaders, but the church in Rome was not happy with this fellow Marcion, so they kicked him out, and he went and became the bishop in the city of Sinope. Now, Marcion is influenced by some of these ideas that we talked about when we were discussing Gnosticism. He comes to the conclusion that the God of the Old Testament is a bad God. He's the demiurge. He's the creator God who has to do with material. And then there's this good God, right? God the Father of Jesus. He's the good God. And so Marcion, he says, what we need to do is we need to make sure that we have the right collection of writings. We need to form a canon. So he gets the Gospel of Luke, he gets some of the Pauline material and edits it, and he just really chooses the material that is going to back up his position, which again resembles a lot of this Gnostic thought that we spoke about previously. Now, this, of course, was a problem. But the first Christian canon, even though it was a heretical Christian canon, goes back to this fellow Marcion. He is the first guy as a Christian leader, albeit a heretical bishop. Don't tell our bishops that I ever put those two words together, okay? But that's what Marcion was. He was a bishop and a heretic. But he's the first one to say, we need to have this collection of authoritative writings, and I've got it. I've got this version of Luke. I've got these sections from Paul. This right here is the true heart of the Christian message. Well, this is, of course, problematic because Christians in other areas and in other places disagreed. As we said, we spoke, for example, of Irenaeus and his battle against the Gnostics. So that's a little bit later in history. Not a whole lot, though. But about the battle against Gnosticism. And one of the first things that they have to deal with is, is the Old Testament, is the God of the Old Testament also the God of the New Testament? And of course, the church says yes. But of course, that's what Marcion was saying is wrong, and other Gnostics. They were saying that's not the case.
And can you define Gnosticism for us again?
Yeah, Gnosticism is really a whole family of philosophies and heresies that seeped into the Christian churches. The word comes from the Greek word for knowledge, gnosis. And it means that there's secret knowledge that you need to have in order to liberate the divine spark within you from the evil of your fleshly body, to be reunited with God. Okay? So Gnosticism, if you believe that matter is evil, then you're probably not going to think very highly of the doctrine of the incarnation, right? That the Word of God becomes true flesh in a human being. Well, the church, as they dealt with these different issues, we have different authors suggesting different forms or different lists regarding the canon. Now, today, we very clearly divide between books that are in the New Testament, that are inspired, and books that are just not, right? They're not part of the canon. For the first couple of centuries, as the church is figuring out how to deal with Marcion and his canon and Gnosticism and other heresies as well, they are going to devise not just two categories, right? Inspired, not inspired, but more than that. So, some books are really universally acknowledged as being valid. What books would these be? Pretty much as soon as we have lists or canons or the beginning of this discussion about inspiration and what is really apostolic and good, the four Gospels are clearly in. The four Gospels are clearly in. There's no one who doubts that these four Gospels really are faithful representations of the person and ministry of Jesus Christ. Some people also like the gospel according to Thomas. Okay? Some don't, some do. So you can actually go online and read the gospel according to Thomas, but it ultimately did not make it in. Irenaeus has a great argument for this. He says, well, of course there are going to be 4 gospels because there are 4 directions to the compass. So just to give you an idea of, he's got other arguments too, but just to give you an idea of some of the more different ways of thinking that were present in the early church. Then there were some books that were rejected. Okay? Like the Apocalypse of Peter, for example, and here's a book that you can dig it up and read it if you want to, but no one in the church uses this anymore. So these are books that are rejected. Now, different people have different lists. Okay, Tertullian has a list. There's another group called the Muratorian Canon. If we were doing a whole semester on church history, we'd discuss each one of these, but we're not, so don't worry. But the point is, there's this discussion going on. So you have the books that are clearly inspired, that are good. You have books that are rejected. And then you have a third category of books that are sort of like disputed or they're doubted. And some of the books that are not in the New Testament were in this. So, for example, I think the Shepherd of Hermes, which is not in the New Testament, some churches were actually using this in their Sunday worship. That's another one of those books that you can go and read it online very easily. But then some of the books in our New Testament were also in this disputed category. Anybody have an idea of some of those books? James. Actually, the main one who's going to doubt James is a later fellow named Martin Luther, right? Martin Luther, 1,500 or 1,400 years later, he was saying, well, while we are at this activity of revisiting church traditions, why not revisit this other one, which is the New Testament canon? Zwingli, another reformer, really was suspicious of Revelation, okay? We've seen so many people do crazy stuff with Revelation lately. Maybe he was right. But anyway, in the Eastern Orthodox Church, they, of course, acknowledge the inspiration of Revelation, but because it's such a challenging book and can lead to such creative thinking, they don't use it during their yearly liturgy, okay? Now, but let's forget the Reformation for the time being. Hebrews. Why would some churches not want to use Hebrews? Why would some churches be suspicious of this letter, although probably it's actually a homily or a sermon if you really look at it? Why would some be suspicious of this?
Because the authorship is in question?
Yeah. Even to this day, we're not really sure who wrote this text. Now, there are very venerable and solid arguments for Pauline authorship or Apollos, But ultimately, at the end of the day, we're just not certain who wrote Hebrews. And the actual text itself doesn't tell us who wrote the sermon to what is probably a text. Hebrews, 2nd and 3rd John, 2nd Peter. So these were all in different lists. Sometimes they were placed in the disputed category. We're not sure what to do with these books. Some churches are utilizing these books and believe that they have apostolic backing and that they are uniquely inspired by the Spirit. And other churches just are not using them, okay? So we have this situation where you really have a much more dynamic context in terms of the categories of the books for these early centuries, right? Today, again, we're so used to they're in or they're out. In the early church, different places have different traditions. But again, as we will see shortly, eventually there will be this kind of consensus, a Catholic consensus, a consensus across all the churches throughout all these different places, the different continents. What are these people looking for? What are these church fathers, these bishops and scholars, what are they looking for to figure out whether a book is in or out? Are they looking for something that is going to make them happy and feel like self-validated? I think that's what Americans would look for if we were making a New Testament canon today, right? No. They were really looking for two primary things. One of those is apostolic backing. Okay? So for example, Mark, the Gospel of Mark. Now Mark himself is not one of the apostles. He's not one of the 12 disciples, right? But according to a very ancient tradition, which I think is pretty solid, Mark was a companion and a co-laborer with who? With Peter. Well, Paul, but later Peter, right? With Peter. So they say this has apostolic backing. Take a moment to reflect on the nature of this critical thought. These are not people who just believe in superstitions or believe in what is told to them. They're really asking these questions. Who wrote this? And what evidence are they basing that on? And indeed today, if we're doing a historical study, that's the same kind of question we would ask, isn't it? If someone says, I've got this fantastic new biography of Richard Nixon, okay? Fantastic new biography of Richard Nixon. And it's going to change, it's got all this new information, and that's what we're going to ask. We're going to ask, what is your backing? And if that person says, well, I just read some other books and this is what I wrote, we would be pretty suspicious. But if that person says, well, what I did is I did extensive interviews with the main people who were part of his family and who were working with him in the White House during those years, and then later on, then we would say, okay, that's actually what we're looking for if we want to know that a book is trustworthy. So we definitely have some critical thinking going on here. And these people are talking about this. They're like, who wrote this? Who is the backing behind Luke? Okay, and that would be Paul. Although Paul himself, even in his own letters, he's sometimes apologetic about having been one as born unnaturally, right? Because he wasn't there with Jesus during his earthly ministry. Also, Paul's letters to the churches, these are also, by a very early date, along with the four Gospels, considered to be very solid. So, while yes, it's true that it's not until the late 4th century that we actually have the precise canon that we have today, in terms of thinking theologically, the early church, by the year 150, certainly 200, really does have the four Gospels and the key Pauline letters to the churches. 1st and 2nd Timothy, the pastoral epistles, some people are not entirely certain about those. So they're looking for apostolic backing. Another thing that people are looking for is Catholic use. And again, by Catholic, I don't mean Roman Catholic. That way of thinking doesn't even exist at this time in history. By Catholic, I mean universality. So there is the conviction that somehow local churches have the Holy Spirit, right? That's a pretty basic doctrine. You know, what animates your body is your spirit in your body. What animates the body of the church is the Spirit of God, which is the Spirit of the church. And that the local churches have the Holy Spirit, and because they have the Spirit, they have wisdom and the ability to discern and the ability to say, this is apostolic, this is what we have been taught, this is the right faith. Remember, that's the word orthodoxy. The right faith, the right praise, the right worship. So when a lot of different churches are using something, even if you might have a question about authorship like Hebrews, that is taken as a sign that there's something that's really true here. So for example, ultimately the church in Rome, which was famous for being very conservative, very austere in its liturgy and in its worship, and being kind of like the fundamentalists of the day, right? Kind of being very suspicious of any kind of innovations or new stuff. The Church of Rome is suspicious of Hebrews. They're just not using it. But ultimately, because the churches in Asia and the churches in Africa are using Hebrews, the church in Rome says, okay, we are going to acknowledge that you have discerned through the Spirit that this is apostolic, even though we still don't know the author. So these are some of the things that people are looking for, that the leaders and thinkers of the church are thinking about and talking about. Well, the first actual mention of the precise list of the New Testament canon that we have, that is identical to the one today, is in the year 367. It's not the result of a synod. Okay, a synod is a gathering of local bishops and elders, priests, whatever you want to call them. And this is from a guy that we talked a lot about last week, and we'll talk about him again in 2 weeks because he's just that important. And I'm talking about Athanasius. Athanasius was the patriarch or the bishop of the city of Alexandria. So the year 367, in one of his writings, he lists out these precise books that we have in the New Testament. And then in the year 382, we have an important development outside of Africa and now in Rome. And this is the name of the Pope, or the name of the Bishop of Rome at this time, is a man named Damasus. And in the year 382, there's a Synod of Rome. This is not an ecumenical council like Nicaea, where everybody, all the bishops get together. It is a synod of the local bishops and the local elders. And here, in 382, at the Synod of Rome, we find the exact same list that we had from Athanasius. And that's in the year 382. This is a very important figure, Damasus, Bishop of Rome, Pope, if you want to call him that. Pope has always been an informal title. What does the word Pope mean? Papa. What does Papa mean in Spanish? Dad, yeah. So Pope has always been an informal title. Whenever I'm teaching church history, one of my questions for my students is always, how do you become Pope? You become the Bishop of Rome. That's how you become Pope, right? Well, anyway, who here has heard of the Biblia Sacra Vulgata, or the Vulgate? My wife, she's like, yeah, I know. You've got that $70 Latin book. Yeah, we could have had like a nice dinner for that. I'm sorry. Okay. Yeah, so what's the Vulgate? What is this?
Jerome.
Yeah, exactly. Saint Jerome, who's from the city of Rome, who in carrying his cross, and he's a monk, we'll talk about that more in 2 weeks, he is commissioned by his bishop, by Pope Damasus, to translate the Bible from the original languages into Latin. And so if you go to the city of Bethlehem, which is where he finished his life, in the town square you'll see a big statue of Saint Jerome. A lot of the Muslims don't like that because they don't like statues, but he's there. And you can visit the actual cave where this guy lived as a monk and as a scholar and as a translator, and he translated the Bible utilizing the Septuagint, also utilizing what Hebrew manuscripts he had, I think. And he said he did want to learn Hebrew. And I don't know if this is historically true, but he said, so I found an old Jewish shepherd, and I hung out with him, and he taught me Hebrew. Right? And he translates the Bible into what is up there with the King James translation of the Bible, one of the two most important translations of the entire Bible in the history of the Christian faith. So he translates the Vulgate. Okay, and the Vulgate, of course, this is the official Bible of the Western churches all the way up until, well, the Reformation, and then for the Catholic Church up until Vatican II, which is back in the 1960s. So this is an enormously important figure, Jerome, commissioned by his bishop, Damasus, and this is the same man who is there at the Synod of Rome in 382 when the Roman Church says, yes, this list that's being used in the churches in Africa, we agree with it. So by now, by the year 382, you really have a very solid consensus. And we can speak by the year 382 of one list of New Testament books that is the same in Europe, Africa, Asia, and it's the same one that we have today. Let me tell you a little bit about a man named Eusebius. Eusebius is considered the father of church history. And he was working with the Emperor Constantine, so we're talking about the mid to early 4th century, so earlier than the Synod of Rome. And Eusebius, in the year 330, he still is dealing, though, with these different categories. So the specific categories that Eusebius uses are the accepted books, the disputed books, and the rejected books. So again, by the year 382, we have this kind of Catholic consensus of the New Testament, but as early as the year 330, we still have some discussion and disputation about this. Now, I just talked about the Bishop of Rome, and we have a little bit of time left. So let me make a couple of comments on the role of the Bishop of Rome. I was just teaching an intensive course in Zambia on church history, and all my students were like mostly Baptists. And I was talking about the Bishop of Rome in the early church. And so then they would say, so, well, who's right? Is it the Roman Catholics or is it us? And I said, the early church had its own way of living and thinking, and it doesn't really totally correspond to either. So what is the role of the Bishop of Rome? Now, the Bishop of Rome is important. He is not just another pastor, okay? So from that point of view, yeah, the Protestants are wrong, right? Or the Baptists are wrong. My Baptist students. He's not just another pastor. The Bishop of Rome very early on has a unique place, a unique status of being really respected and honored by other bishops and other people. Part of this is simply because the city of Rome is the capital of the Roman Empire, though as we saw earlier, Constantine will create another capital over in the east in Constantinople. So that's one reason. Also, the city of Rome was seen as sort of bringing together the missions, the two primary missions of the church, the mission to the Jews and the mission to the Gentiles, because who was the one who was, preaching to the Jews? Peter. And who was the missionary or the apostle to the Gentiles? Paul. And according to tradition, I think this is a very solid historical tradition personally, both Peter and Paul are martyred in the city of Rome. So people saw this as, and understood this as kind of a way of recognizing that the city had sort of been sanctified and blessed in a unique way because these two great church leaders had been martyred there. And of course, there develops an early tradition that since Peter was in Rome as one of the apostles, of course, he's going to be the head of the church in Rome, the chief elder or the bishop of Rome. This is why to this day in the Catholic Church, the Pope is called the vicar or the successor, the representative of Peter, right? Because Peter is the first bishop in Rome, and then afterwards, everybody else who is there in the city of Rome, those are his successors. So this is the way of thinking. However, from the other point of view, though, the Bishop of Rome doesn't have authority, nor does he really ever claim authority, to just go into foreign churches and order affairs. His authority is much more like an appellate court or a Supreme Court. A Supreme Court can only rule on issues that after a lengthy process, after the local resources, the county, the state, have been exhausted, only then, and then only if it's appealed up to, only if one of the two parties says, okay, we're going to go to the Supreme Court, right? And only then can that court really adjudicate or rule on this or that issue. That is, I think, a pretty good approximation of the sort of authority that we find with the Bishop of Rome during these early centuries. Later on, the churches in the East will be devastated by the growth and expansion of Islam. Many of the patriarchal churches over there, Antioch, Jerusalem, Alexandria, will quickly come under the authority of Islam. And then later on, during the Middle Ages, Europe will begin to kind of flourish and become more powerful, more wealthy. And that's really when you have the height of papal power and you have this claim of universal jurisdiction. In the early church, you never have any pope saying, we have jurisdiction over the entirety of the church. Okay, that is indeed the position of the Roman Catholic Church today. So again, I hope you can see, well, the Catholics, they have some history that sort of backs them up, but then on the other hand, there's not a clear continuity, between universal jurisdiction and the early church. You just don't find that doctrine or that practice outlined in the early church. Okay, so just in conclusion, we looked at a couple of key things that led up to the formation of the New Testament canon. One, you already had the idea or the concept of a canon with the Old Testament. You also had the challenge of Marcion, the bishop of Sinope, who formed the first canon, and so people had to really take this issue up, saying, well, that one's wrong. Well, then what's the right one? And then we had a number of different categories, not simply in or out. We had disputed books, and even those lists differed from time to time. We also looked at what were these church leaders looking for? What were some of their main criteria? And they were looking for apostolic backing, and they were looking for Catholic use, among other things. We looked at the first list that we ever find, which is in 367 from Athanasius. And then we saw that the Synod of Rome in 382, we have that same list adopted by the church in Rome. So it's there in Alexandria, a very important church. It's there in Rome, perhaps the most important church. This becomes, this really is where we can talk of one New Testament canon, 382. And this is also where we have the commissioning of the Vulgate, which St. Jerome will carry out.